Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. This video will go over Southern society in the years before the Civil War. It will focus on the institution of slavery and how that grew during the early 19th century. It will also look a little bit at the various tiers of white society in the South in the antebellum years, and also a brief look at the status of free blacks in the South during that time. So the economy of the South was evolving a lot in the early 1800s. Tobacco production was going down because the fields were worn out. Tobacco is extremely labor intensive. This led to a diversification of the economy in the South, some more crafts and, like small scale cottage industry manufacturing popped up. Some other crops began to replace tobacco in fields that couldn't sustain tobacco anymore, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The other big cash crop in the South, other than tobacco in the early years, was indigo, which was the plant that makes the purple dye. That was kind of a high priced commodity in Europe, but Britain was one of the biggest purchasers of indigo. So when the Revolutionary War happened, and then the embargo and the War of 1812 and all of that, the indigo industry just sort of collapsed because they didn't have anyone else to buy it. And cotton ends up kind of filling the void of tobacco and indigo. So cotton used to not be a very viable cash crop because it was way too labor intensive and took way too many hands to make enough cotton to actually make it worth it. Of course, that changed in 1793 when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which was something you could use to clean the seeds and the dirt out of cotton and create clean lint. So cleaning a pound of lint went from taking about 12 hours to taking just a matter of, seconds to do. And so this happens around the same time that textile manufacturing is taking off both in England and in the United States. And so cotton explodes as the primary cash crop of the American South. By the time the Civil War came around, the southern states were producing about 60% of the cotton supply for the entire world. India also produced a good bit for the British Empire. And by 1840, half of all American exports were cotton. So it was the backbone of the Southern economy. And to make that industry go, it required a lot of hands to pick the cotton. And of course, that's where slavery begins to grow. Ironically, slavery was, even in the South, sort of petering out by the time 1800 rolled around because tobacco was declining. And slavery by that time was pretty much dead in the North. A lot of the northern states had banned slavery around the time of the Declaration of Independence or early in the national period. But slavery grew as the cotton industry grew in the early 1800s. By 1860, which is the last census before the Civil War, there were 4 million enslaved people in the United States. That's out of a total population in the South of about 9 million. So you're looking at about 40 to 45% of the southern states' populations being enslaved. The population grew mostly due to births. The Constitution banned the importation of enslaved people from offshore as of 1807. It still happened. There was still some smuggling of cargo of enslaved people, through the Caribbean and stuff, but that was much more sporadic. The population mostly grew because slaves had children. The population shifted further south throughout the 19th century of enslaved people because that's where the land was being cultivated for cotton, especially an area of like Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi that is known as the Black Belt. That has nothing to do with the race of people who are living there. It has to do with the very, very black soil that is found in that area, and it was incredibly rich, and it was incredibly conducive to growing cotton. So that's where the slave population began to shift. It had been sort of more in the upper South and the more populated areas like Virginia and the Carolinas before, and then you begin to see it go down more toward the Gulf Coast states. Enslaved people could be sold further south as punishment if they ran away or disobeyed in some way. That was seen as a punishment because the institution of slavery was much more brutal in the South because of just the horrible, conditions and the heat and the long hours picking cotton and working the fields and things like that. Slave society was fairly resilient. Given the circumstances, family was incredibly important. On the larger plantations that had, hundreds, if not thousands of enslaved people, families tended to be more stable just because it was less likely that you would be sold away. If you have a large group of people, it's less likely a group of like 3 or 4 be messed with than, if you only had like 10 or 20, right? Marriage wasn't legal. It wasn't recognized by any southern state, but it was done anyway and sort of recognized internally within slave society. As an example of how precarious that could be, though, on a lot of plantations, the marriage vows were altered to say, "Till death or distance do us part," which is really sad to think about, of course. Most slaves were illiterate, not all. But because of that, oral traditions were very, very important, passing down stories about ancestry, traditions, and tales from ancestral homes back in Africa and things like that. So despite horrifying conditions, slaves tended to make the most of their their predicament, and kept their families together through the most horrible circumstances, and again yearned to be free, I suppose. There was resistance by slaves. It was usually kind of passive or isolated, like slaves would run away, or they just wouldn't work, or they would dilly-dally, do as little work as they possibly could, things like that. There were very few organized slave rebellions in the United States. Only one even got off the ground. One slave rebellion happened in 1831, led by a slave preacher named Nat Turner, where he managed to get a group of enslaved people in like southeastern Virginia together to kind of go on a rampage and kill about 60 or 70 white people in the area before it was finally subdued after a couple of days. There were some other attempts at slave uprisings. Gabriel Prosser in 1800, Denmark Vesey in South Carolina in 1822. But those were basically found out through various means before anything actually happened. A quick look at white society in the antebellum period. When people think of white Southerners in the years before the Civil War, these are the people they tend to think of. This is the whole Gone with the Wind thing, right? Like the stinking, filthy rich people living on these giant plantations with the big White House on the hill and things like that. That was like not even the 1%. That was like the 1/10 of 1%, or even 1% of 1%. That owned more than 100 slaves and had these giant tracts of land that were used to cultivate cotton or other crops. But they controlled most of the wealth. It's a similarity to today, right? Where a very small group of people control the lion's share of the resources. All that money afforded them the opportunity to travel the world and go to college and things like that. Wherever they would go, like for instance, like Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederate States of America during the Civil War, the rebels, he went to West Point. John C. Calhoun, the South Carolinian, I believe he went to Yale. So, these people, they used that money to kind of educate themselves and kind of, ingratiate themselves to the other rich people in society. Typically, it was a really strict cult of domesticity, where the men and women had very separate spheres on these large plantations. Men saw the business side of it. Women would oversee the household. And all of this money and all of that sort of leads to this what they call the Cavalier tradition. So around this time is when this British author named Sir Walter Scott started writing books about medieval England, most notably Ivanhoe, which you might have heard of. But people read that in the South and thought that it hit, and they started basically trying to reinstate chivalry and honor and stuff like that. The idea of like knights codes and whatnot in the South. So the idea of like Southern honor and things like that sort of like stems from this. But again, that was just a tiny group of the population. Only 25% or so of white people in the South owned any enslaved people at all. And most people who owned slaves had only a handful, 10 or less. And those people were kind of like your middle class, I guess, maybe upper middle class. They would work in the field with their enslaved people typically. they did not make as much money, things like that. The white majority, the largest chunk of the population were people who owned no enslaved people. They were subsistence farmers that, just kind of made enough money to get by. Then you have like the very, very poorest white people who had been sort of like run off the cultivated the land that could be cultivated in the more soil rich areas, and they were living on clay and rock and stuff like that further inland. They were thought of as being like lazy. They probably were just like really sickly and suffered from malnutrition and things like that. It's worth pointing out though that even those people, they hated the upper crust. They couldn't stand them because they saw them as like the snobs, right? But even then, they defended the institution of slavery and were the ones who went to war for the rebels during the Civil War in really large numbers, because there's kind of that like, it's sort of a bastardized version of the carrot on a stick or the American dream, right? Where like, okay, well, maybe if I can find just a little bit of land, I can make a little bit of money, and then I can buy a little bit more land. Maybe I can buy a couple of slaves, and then I can just like, kind of keep going and going and going. And then I'll be the guy in the big house on the hill. Was that realistic? No, but it kind of kept them motivated, you could say. And then if there are outcasts in this system, the people who are in the mountains would fit into that category. These are folks who were Scotch-Irish mostly, immigrated to America in the colonial period, moved up into the hills because it's kind of the geography they were used to in Europe, and they just sort of stayed there and didn't have much contact with people outside of the mountains. And on a personal note, that's my ancestors. I'm originally from the North Carolina-Tennessee state line. They retained a lot of British customs. British idioms and slang can still be found like in Appalachian dialect to this day. When the Civil War came around, a lot of those people actually were pro-Union. Most notably, the western counties of West Virginia, or western counties of Virginia, I should say, broke away from Virginia and formed a new state in 1863 during the Civil War that was pro-Union, West Virginia. And then finally, the free blacks, which are sometimes called the third race. Most of them did live in the South. There were about 250,000 of them in the last census before the Civil War in 1860. Sometimes they were freed after the Revolution because their owners got caught up in Enlightenment, revolutionary era fever, I guess. Some of them were mixed race. They would have a enslaved mother who was raped by a white slave owner. And then some of them were able to purchase their freedom. Not all slaves, but some were allowed to make money off the clock if they were done with their assigned job for the day. They could learn a trade. They could, play music and at parties or what have you. And save them enough money to purchase themselves from their owners. It was not super common, but also not unheard of. Some black people in the South owned property. There are a handful who enslaved people themselves. That is extremely rare, but it did happen. You did run the risk of being kidnapped back into slavery, paperwork being sort of spurious as it was. Most notably, Solomon Northup, who was a free black in New York, had traveled to Washington, D.C., which was a slave-owning town, for work, and he was kidnapped and held as a slave for 12 years. There's a movie, 12 Years a Slave, about that came out several years ago. Rights of free blacks sort of depended on what state you were in. Sometimes you could own property, sometimes you couldn't. Sometimes you could vote, sometimes you couldn't. Sometimes you could, serve on a jury, sometimes you couldn't. It just depended on where you were. But free blacks tended to be unpopular, even in the North, which, you think of the North as being pro-union, anti-slavery, and all of that, but not everybody felt that way. And as Irish immigration especially picked up in the 1840s, you began to have competition between Irish immigrants and free blacks for jobs, which led to a lot of racism by the Irish towards African Americans in the North. That will do it for today. If you're one of my students, we'll pick this up a little more in class as we go through this unit. If you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the comments. Cheers.